All right, good evening. My name is Harrison Pinckney, and I am glad to welcome you all to this discussion on the role of faith-based youth programs during the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, Before I get started, just wanted to make a few notes to assist us with how we're going to move through tonight's discussion. There's a chat function that is available to you all. And so what we would encourage you to do is, as we are presenting tonight, please feel free to write down any thoughts or any questions that you may have in that chat box. And what will happen is at the end of the discussion, we'll begin to address some of those questions. Feel free to send notes to each other as well as you all are talking. If someone makes a comment in that chat box that resonates with you, feel free to encourage one another. And hopefully we can learn from one another tonight, although I'll do a reasonable amount of talking, and so will Bob Ditter. It's my hope that you all will shed some light and help us to understand sort of what's going on in your communities that maybe we're not aware of. And also, before I get started, I want to definitely take a moment to thank my colleagues who are on here. I'm the face of this particular presentation, but there are a number of other people that have been assisting with preparation for this. So in addition to Bob Ditter, who you all will hear from shortly, there's also Ms. Shauna Cass, who is a valuable member of our department at Clemson in our Park Recreation and Tourism Department, and she's helping to sort of facilitate this online discussion and make sure that we don't have any hiccups with Zoom or any other communication that might need to take place tonight. And also my graduate student, Thomas Clanton, who will sort of be tracking those questions that you all are submitting. So I want to thank them before we get started. So I'm going to jump right into it. Now, there are a range of youth programs that exist, and even when people were registering for tonight, we recognized that there were some members from the YMCA and a few other organizations that are not necessarily faith-based organizations. So why have we chosen to specifically give attention to this particular segment tonight? All right, so the first thing is that we are noticing around the world, not just in the United States, but around the world, that there's this renewed focus on faith. Dr. Benson is a professor in Denmark, and she's been doing some Google Analytics, and what she has found is that for roughly every 80,000 cases of coronavirus that is reported in the news, there's a significant spike in searches online for prayers. And so what she is finding is not specific to a specific denomination or even a specific faith or belief system, but across the board that people of different faiths are sort of flocking back to some of their roots. And she was showing through one of the studies that she's been conducting since February that, again, every 80,000 or so, increase of 80,000 or so reported cases of the coronavirus, there's this significant spike. In fact, some of these searches for prayers have actually been the highest that has ever been seen online, surpassing holy days like Christmas, Easter, Ramadan, Passover, where typically during those times of the year, you'll find people looking up prayers and scriptures. Even those have been surpassed. Those numbers have been surpassed. Additionally, publishers, especially here in the United States, are reporting that they are selling far more religious literature, Bibles, and things of that nature than they ever have, in the past few years. And so it's all pointing to the fact that people are really turning to their faith, not just for answers, but for security, for assurance, for hope. And so, so that was one of the things that sort of caught our attention. Another thing that we recognized is that for a lot of our teenagers, they're often involved in after-school programs, student government, Beta Club, sports, band, and due to the recommendations for social distancing, these teenagers are losing the opportunity to really connect with those groups in the ways that they have done so in the past. And so it's leaving a major void. And where some of those groups are unable to continue to have a viable option for keeping up with their teenagers, we're recognizing that a lot of faith-based organizations already have the infrastructure in place because they're already a part of communities, and they interact with people's lives in a very different way, so that they already have things in place that they can naturally continue to interact with young people. And so recognizing all of those things, our goal tonight is to, start here equipping you all that are working with your teenagers and your youth. And I know a few of you are working with younger kids as well, and understanding how can your organization better serve the youth that you're trying to reach. And so in order to do that, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to take about 10, 12 minutes to sort of paint a picture for you all, to help us to understand what are the things that our teenagers are dealing with. We are aware of, some of the more obvious things, trying to, learn from home and trying to manage, school without having a physical teacher in the room. Being away from friends is also a very trying experience for a lot of our teenagers. But there are some other things that we're noticing that you may be aware of, or you may be aware of to some extent, or some things that you may not be aware of at all. And so we want to try to bring attention to those things tonight. And so I'll start by painting a picture, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bob Ditter. And what he will do is he'll start giving us some ideas about how can we help and really assure and reassure our teenagers as they're going through this difficult time. So this first slide doesn't really come as a major surprise to most of us. There are a lot of concerns for health and safety. Across the country, we have seen spikes in reports around domestic abuse and domestic violence, police and social workers having to be called to homes. But there are also concerns that youth are equally in positions where there might be a spike in the cases of abuse that they are experiencing. Some of this is just a result of living in abusive homes, and where school might have provided 8 or 9 hours of safety. Now they're home 24/7. Other factors that might influence this are just tense times and being in stressful environments. And so adults or even other teens, other youth, not necessarily having healthy outlets for some of the stress that they might be experiencing. And this can result in some of the abuse that our teenagers are, being exposed to. Additionally, we know some of our teenagers might be experiencing increased amounts of neglect. We are seeing a lot of schools and restaurants that are trying to respond to the need for hot meals for a lot of our teenagers, but still recognizing that it's more than just not having access to a hot meal, but there may be actual cases of neglect where teenagers are consistently being ignored in their homes. And this, again, something that extends far beyond just not being in class or not being able to interact with their friends. And again, we already talked about the limited access to hot meals. Now, I've been following this ongoing study that is currently taking place each week. Ms. Noel, what she is doing is she is sending out surveys nationwide and having teenagers respond, and asking them sort of how are they coping with COVID-19. She's asking questions about what are their concerns, what are their fears, how are they spending their time in order to maximize their time at home. And so towards the end of March, the study that took place with a little bit over 3,000 teenagers, I found a few of these statistics that were interesting. When asked to best describe how do they feel, it was, as you can see in the chart here, majority of the kids expressed that they were either frustrated or nervous, with some saying very nervous. And of course, you see these other ideas of disconnected, which we understand, sad, hopeful, angry, and some kids even being indifferent, some youth being indifferent, maybe not fully understanding the scope and gravity of the pandemic. So go a step further and begin to ask the youth, why are they frustrated or nervous? And some of the things that really rose to the top, some of the main concerns were safe, healthy, and well-being. But it wasn't safe, healthy, and well-being for themselves. It was actually for their families. You know, so some of these teenagers are having to wrestle with the possibility of a family member who's either working or a family member who might be more vulnerable because of age or because of health factors. They're wrestling with the possibility of those individuals becoming ill. And equally of importance was this idea that a lot of teenagers are struggling with. They were engaged in various activities, and now those activities have come to a halt, and some are concerned about their future plans. And we'll get into this in a moment, but a lot of graduating seniors, for example, and as they're thinking about college and what is college going to look like? Will the school's year start on time? Will I have to repeat a grade? These are some of the concerns that some of our teenagers are dealing with. Thirdly was getting the virus, actually contracting the virus, and the students went on to say not just contracting the virus, but possibly dying from the virus. And this was a concern that many of them had. And then finally, being a carrier and spreading the virus, and less concerned about them being ill, but more concerned about spreading the virus and bringing other people illness. And so these were some of the top things that we saw as of 2 weeks ago that teenagers are struggling with. And so while we recognize easily the factors that are stressing and frustrating adults, some of us are even trying to cope with some of those things. We don't want it to be lost that our teenagers are well aware of the significance, or many of our teenagers are well aware of the significance of this pandemic, and they too have some concerns. And so as we are thinking about how do we approach them, how do we support them, one of the things we want to encourage you all to do is to keep in mind that they are they're more than just bored or more than just missing their friends. They really do have some serious and legitimate concerns, not just about themselves, but about the well-being of the people around them. And so this is something that we would encourage you to take to mind and take to heart. So let's talk about school and what's going on in school. So what we're seeing, of course, as I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, is that our teenagers are being removed from their extracurricular activities. And when we think about some of the kids that we're working with, we know that some of us have star athletes that are a part of our organization that we interact with. We have some kids that were in band, and this is that time of year that, or just past 2 weeks ago, that a lot of these students might have been engaged in state championships for basketball, for example, or getting ready for symphonic band and competitions. And a lot of those opportunities have now been lost, right? And so what happens is it's more than just we didn't get to play basketball a few more weeks. For some of these kids, it could be very devastating to think that this was our year, that we really thought we had a chance to accomplish whatever goals we set for ourselves, and we never even got a chance to get started. And so as we think about that, understanding that it's more than just, oh, you don't get to participate in your extracurricular activities, but there may be some disappointment that is attached that again is very legitimate and very real, and may influence the way that the level of effectiveness we have in connecting with our teenagers, when in the back of their minds they're still holding on to some of this disappointment. Equally so is the academic futures. What we are seeing around the country, and I have citations here, and we'll be more than happy to share some of these articles with you all. But what we're seeing around the country is a lot of school districts and a lot of states are starting to wrestle with, how do they handle grading at this point? How do they handle advancing students to the next academic year? A lot of school districts are starting to suggest that there's going to be a need to sit down and have conversations with individuals and with parents about, do we advance your child to the next grade, or do we ask them to stay behind and repeat this grade? And while no state has, or no school district has made any definitive decisions, we do see that there are examples of discussions that are taking place. And thinking about, what does that mean for a teenager to know that next year was supposed to be my senior year, but I'm being asked to repeat the 11th grade? Or next year I do go into the senior year, but because I missed the last quarter of this current school year, now I'm sort of at a deficit, and I'm struggling to keep up with my work. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that a lot of our teenagers are going to be dealing with, not just now in the immediate future, but 12 months from now, we may still continue to see some of the effects and impacts of this. All right. Loss. And so, as I mentioned in that chart, a lot of our teenagers are concerned about the potential for loss, but we do know that some are experiencing actual loss. Loss of loved ones, loss of friends to the coronavirus, and then of course just the general loss of contact while they wait for this pandemic to move on, where we can be able to reemerge and from our homes and re-engage one another in society. And so, wanting to challenge us to think about, what do we do? Are we prepared to help coach our students through those moments where they may find that they have a loved one or a friend that has succumbed to this pandemic? Or what we're seeing is some people are dying of natural causes, but there is no opportunity to really say a true farewell because of the pandemic. We're not able to gather for celebrations of life the way that we're traditionally used to. And so these are things that, again, not that all of our teenagers are dealing with, maybe none of your teenagers, but just want us to think about, are we prepared, or do we have a game plan? Have we thought about some of these challenges that may be on the horizon? And then lastly is parental job loss. And so when we look at teenagers, especially high schoolers, we start to see that we're at an age where we become aware of, to some extent, the need for economic advancement, the need for income in order for us to live. And so for some teenagers, possibly either watching their parents struggle with loss of job or loss of hours, and they understand what that possibly means for the family, and they start to maybe internalize some of that and figure out, what can I do to help my family, or what can I do to not be as much of a burden on my family? And that's a lot for a 13-year-old or even an 18-year-old to take on. But these are things that some of our teenagers are currently dealing with. Some of them may continue to deal with in the coming months. And so wanting us to think again about, how are we preparing ourselves beyond, sort of the weekly check-ins that we're doing? What else can we do to make sure that we're prepared to help guide them through this process? All right. And lastly, and then I'll hand it over to Bob here, but lastly, want us to think about our seniors. A number of states have already begun to acknowledge, and a number of school districts have begun to acknowledge, Florida and Texas are two good examples, that some of those senior class rites of passage will not happen. So senior trips, prom, graduation, they are being canceled. A lot of schools we're still seeing are holding out hope for graduation. But some of these other significant moments that mark that last year of school are no longer an option for our teenagers. And so the question becomes, not so much what do we do to program and come up with a cool and creative way to have a virtual prom, which could work, but more importantly, how do we help our kids grieve through that and recognize that while while we are hoping that they're going to have other milestones that they will accomplish in life, at this stage, this is probably some of the biggest letdowns that they've experienced up to this point. And so how do we work with those teenagers? How do we reassure them? How do we support them through this time? And ultimately, with the graduation, is not just the pride of walking across the stage and having your family there cheering your name, but it's also that opportunity to say that final goodbye to your classmates, and recognizing, as we talk about high school graduation as well, recognizing that for some of our graduates, they're going to go on to college, and so they'll be able to reclaim that opportunity to cross the stage in the future. But for many of our other graduates, this is going to be the height of some of their academic achievements. And again, when you have family that has been sort of excited about this, and this is such a wonderful time, you know, and now what do we do, and how do we work with these teenagers, and is there a way for us to do a modified celebration? Is there a way for us to help those students to reclaim some of those moments? And these are the things that we want to encourage us to think about. And for those of us that live in school districts where we haven't canceled prom or graduation, are we preparing ourselves in the event that that moment does in fact come? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Rob Ditter. And Rob is a child and youth and family therapist that lives in Boston. And he describes his job as spending his days working with families, and especially working with teenagers through some of the toughest moments of their lives. And so this is an area in which he really thrives, and has been spending a lot of his time and energy in improving the lives of families in those dark moments. And so, Rob, I'm going to mute my mic and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Harrison. That was a great sort of thumbnail sketch of some of what's going on out there. And before I get started, I'm just going to share my kind of wait for this to kind of go away. There we go. All right. So I just want to say, Harrison, thank you for inviting me to be with your folks tonight. And it is obviously a very somber time for some people. And I appreciate the way you did that great sketch about what some young people are dealing with. As Harrison mentioned to you, I'm a child and family therapist. I see young people. The youngest young man that I'm seeing right now is 8 years old. I see teenagers. I see college students, and I talk to their parents. So I get it from all sides. And I want to just say that there is another way I think that this virus infects us. And I want to talk about it because I think it has a lot to do with your ability to be there for the young people that you work with. And when I've been asked at times to talk to folks who work with young people around the United States, or even in my own practice, when I'm dealing with someone who's suffered such a terrible loss, I sometimes have this feeling myself of, do I have anything in me that could possibly help? Compared to what this young person that I'm sitting with, or these young people that I'm sitting with are going through, am I going to leave them empty-handed? And even speaking to you tonight as folks who work with young people, will I leave you? Am I going to let you down? And my own sense of awe and helplessness in the face of this existential threat. And then I realized, many of you are probably feeling the same thing. If you've been talking to young people, you may yourself feel like, how do I find anything in myself that could possibly help? And, will I just leave my kids, the families that I work with, the teenagers that I work with, some of you may work in youth camp programs, in school vacation camp programs, Bible study programs. You may even yourself have this sense of, what am I going to offer them in the face of, their father, their mother losing their job, their grandmother dying, they can't have their senior year. They've suddenly lost, their college community. How do I find the courage to be strong and clear and helpful in these times? So as youth leaders, I think there's something about being a youth leader where this is especially challenging because most youth leaders, and of course, I don't know any of you personally, but I've worked with, thousands and thousands of youth leaders around the United States. And you're all connectors, right? You're people who like to be with people. You're good at creating trust. You're good at establishing relationships. Inviting people in, and you're problem solvers, right? If two kids are having a problem, you're good at taking action. You're good at figuring out some kind of a program that might work. You're used to creating community. You're good at that, and you're good at building relationships. And so, I don't know about you, but I think a lot of youth leaders are finding this mentally and emotionally exhausting. That the avenues that we have available to us are not available to us. Our own sense of isolation, our own sense of helplessness, the uncertainty that some of us may be facing is challenging. And I think it resonates with one of the messages that I want to talk about tonight. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about this uncertainty and doubt and helplessness, which is, I think, the other way that this virus infects us, right? Obviously, uncertainty in general raises our anxiety level. It makes us feel helpless. One of the things about our brains is that they are hardwired to, catastrophize. There's actually a very well-known, probably the best known psychological sort of factor or tendency, which you've never heard of, is called the negativity bias. And that is when we don't know something, when our brains can't figure out, okay, what's going to happen? Like, how long will this last? Is, my aunt or uncle who got sick, are they going to be okay? Is school going to be able to go back into session? Will I have to, repeat something? Am I going to lose my job? When we don't know and the stakes are high and we don't have a way of knowing, we tend to go to this dark place. It's called catastrophizing. And it robs us of our experience, of us experiencing our own strength. And it can make us feel powerless. And part of what I want to talk to you about tonight is how you yourself deal with that so that you can help the teenagers or the other young people that you are working with who are experiencing it themselves, okay? So we know that the threats and the pain are real, right? Harrison did a great job of reviewing for us and going into some detail about just the very different ways that young people are experiencing that loss. Their father and their mother may have been thrown out of work, or they're about to be thrown out of work, or are they going to be able to make the rent? All of these things. And some people will have some serious infections, and some people are going to die. And a lot of people have already lost their jobs or livelihoods. So our usual way of helping people, which is to be with them, to have meetings, groups, outings, Bible studies together, are not open to us. So part of this is all of us adjusting to this new situation and finding other ways, creative ways to connect with people, whether it's through Instagram or whether it's virtual through, the Zoom calls or and some other things that I want to share with you a little bit later in my presentation. So the challenge in all of this, as we are surrounded by anxiety, helplessness, the threat of loss, uncertainty, fear, is, how do we ourselves be strong? And I came across a quote from the Reverend Rob Lee, who's in North Carolina. And recently he said, yes, the coronavirus is terrible, but it is not the fullness of who we are as a people. It's not the end of our story. And I think it's something that I'd like to encourage all of you to try to kind of grab onto. So I want to talk a little bit about just give you some overview of my remarks tonight. The first thing is, you can't take care of anybody else unless you take care of yourself. One of the things that I learned as a training therapist was I cannot use my patients, my clients, to meet my own emotional needs. And I think it's especially true working with teenagers, with adolescents, that you can't get your emotional needs for closeness, for affirmation. You can't get those needs met from your clients, the people you work with, from the teens that you work with, the young people that you work with. You need to take care of yourself and have your own circle of friends that you get your strength from, that you get your affirmation from, that you get your needs for social connection from. Because it's important that you take care of yourself before you try to be there for someone else. The next thing is I want to talk a little bit about the basics of our alarm system, because it's hardwired. As we were all in ancient times standing around the campfire, roasting the beast that we had just hunted, somebody in our ranks had to be looking over our shoulder into the dark woods to make sure that something wasn't going to come to eat us. This sense of being alarmed and catastrophizing or being worried about, like, what's going to happen to us is hardwired into us. It's not going to go away. And I want you to be able to face it. And I'm going to give you some tips about how to deal with that. Because if you're alarmed or if you're frightened and then you're talking to a teen who's frightened, I don't want that to overwhelm you or keep you from being there for that teenager or for that adolescent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the emotional self-care, psychological self-care, which is the head. I want to talk a little bit about empathy versus compassion, which is the heart. And then I want to talk about some tips for working with young people in general, the 5 mistakes that a lot of people make, which I call the feet. And maybe even, if I might dare, although I don't feel I'm qualified, to talk a little bit about your own spiritual self-care. So first of all, a couple of things that I have been finding around the country. I've been speaking really quite a lot in the last 2 weeks with people who work with kids in various settings, whether it's camp people, YMCA, Girl Scouts. And one of the things that we're all, I think, really being reminded of is just how important connection and community are to us, right? That as it's great that we can, be virtually connected through Instagram, Facebook, Zoom calls, FaceTiming. These are all great things. And none of them can match being in person with people. And what's interesting to me is young people who have spent their lives online are discovering that too. It's like, online is cool and I miss my friends. And so I think it's kind of an unkind reminder of just what is important in our lives, which is our relationships. And, and one of the things that Harrison and I spoke about is how you as faith-based workers have already established vital connections. You'll notice that says vital, not virtual, right? You have established vital connections with many young people through the programs that you already have in place. And I think what part of my message is, I want to encourage you to find new and creative ways to use those connections to, to reach out to young people and to be there for them. By the way, parents, I think, are ready to accept you in their children's lives, especially since they have been quarantined at home with them. I, by the way, have kind of joked with teachers and with camp directors and camp professionals and other youth workers how I think parents are going to be even more appreciative after this of how much talent and how much creativity and how valuable the young people are, the adults are who work with their kids when they're not at home. And the other thing is, we all know that kids need to be in the company of caring adults who are not their parents. They need that, especially teenagers who are trying to separate, who are trying to establish their own sense of themselves, their own autonomy, that it is critical, especially in this time, that not be lost. So that they have someone else besides their parents to talk to relate to size things up with, to expand their horizons. And we all need to adapt to this situation and connect in ways that we can. I have heard of, young people who are starting to be pen pals or who are starting chain letters. So there are lots of creative ways that people are connecting. And I think it's great that this virus has in some unkind way reminded us of just how important those connections are. I think youth programs have never been so publicly on view. I know that camp people in particular, and I think many of you have already started on Facebook or through Zoom having gone virtual. I mean, I've seen people doing virtual campfires and sing-alongs. I know a camp that's doing something called Camp TV, which is a noontime, lunchtime show for kids who are at home doing virtual school. And they interview, a favorite staff person, and you can do that too. What's a game you can play? What's a bingo game you can play? What kind of artwork can you do online? Can you have a virtual cookout? Um, a virtual cooking class. And I think that parents are, grateful to have some distraction for their kids. And I think the kids are great for the break in the monotony, but even more important for that connection. And I think you're going to be showing your creativity to what I would say is a very eager audience. And all of you are experts, by the way, in out of school learning. We talk a lot about what are the out of school experiences that reinforce learning. And we know that when children are involved in creative activities where they feel safe, where they're in the company of caring adults, and where they get the opportunity to be with each other, that the learning experiences they have in school are not lost. There's less summer learning loss, for example, or there's less school learning loss when there is a rich out of school learning environment. And that's what you folks do. You're experts at it. So I think keeping your family together has never been more important. And I just wanted, this is kind of like the cheerleading part of my presentation, because I want you to keep that in mind, that using different methods, like I say, cards, letters. I know of a pastor here in Massachusetts, which is where I'm from, who is writing, 10 cards, just postcards a day. And it's interesting how kids are discovering the mail. Many of them don't write letters unless they go off to summer camp and they have to write a letter to get into dinner or something. But, this surprise letter in the mail, it stands out because it's unusual. And so letters and cards, Instagram, different kinds of Facebook postings, having a Bible study online, even having conference calls if kids don't have access. Some kids, as we know, don't have access to the internet, or they have to share a screen with other members of the family. So you're going to have to realize that one size does not fit all, and you may have to find different ways of reaching your audience. And I think that kids need something to help them satisfy their hunger for connection. So it's not just the activity. The activity is an excuse for the connection. So I want to go and talk a little bit about the basics of our alarm system, because I want you to be aware of it and have some tools for dealing with it when you yourself become alarmed. I know many people, who I talk to, are bolt upright at 3 o'clock in the morning, like, oh my goodness, what if I lose my job? What if, I don't get to see my friends again? What we know is that the loss is going to be different, but we know there's going to be loss. The loss is going to be pervasive, even though it's going to strike people very differently according to their own situation. So when like I said, what our brains are designed to do, right? This is what they're built to do. They're built to protect us, right? So when we feel a threat, even a threat we can't see, and we don't know how to solve that threat, we make it up. We invent something, right? And typically we think the worst, right? Our brains, it's called the negativity bias. So it's like we always catastrophize. We go to the worst case scenario, often which is not really what's true. And it's almost a way of preparing ourselves for the worst. Unfortunately, it takes a toll, and it makes it hard for us to make more reasonable choices, or to be more present for people. So, and again, it's designed, our alarm system is designed to help us take action, right? The problem is it tends to make us feel in ways that actually interfere with problem solving, or interfere with our being there for the young people that we work with. So the key is to plan, not panic, right? I remember I had a young fellow in my practice many years ago. I started to see him when he was 9. And he had a very, very close friend, a dear friend that he had met when he was 3 years old. And they did everything together. They slept over each other's houses. They went to, here in Boston would be Red Sox games together. And they, had sleepovers. And my person, I'll call him T, used to say, Christian and I are like twins, except we have different mothers. And unfortunately, what happened is that T's friend contracted a very, very virulent form of leukemia when he was 5. And after about a year and a half, he died. And T went into this downward spiral. And so I started to see this young man at the age of 9, and he had totally defended himself against that sense of loss. But what was happening was his brain, and saying he wouldn't go out, he wasn't meeting new kids, he wasn't playing out on teams. He really had begun to isolate himself. And as he and I kind of got to know each other and we kind of learned more about like what was going on, I was able to say to him that, you know, his brain was basically trying to protect him from that kind of shock. That anytime he had the possibility of joining a soccer team or meeting a new friend or staying over to kid's house after school, his brain would go, no, 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 don't do that. You remember what happened with Christian? You really got burned. I'm here to protect you. Don't do that. And so basically I was able to, in a sense, animate the way that his brain was trying to quote unquote protect him, even though that protective device had really outlived its usefulness and was now becoming dysfunctional. And I said, so T, your brain is trying to protect you. There's only one problem. And he said, what's that? I said, you are very curious about the world. You are going to want to go out there and be curious and discover and meet people. And, you know, if you are constantly giving into your brain that's saying, you know, don't do this, you're going to be very, very disappointed and you're going to be depressed. And he said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, you and I have to outsmart your brain. Well, I have to tell you, he looked at me and goes, I didn't know you could outsmart your brain. I said, sure, I do it all the time. So you have to learn how to outsmart your brain, okay? So when your alarm system is activated, and this is the first part of taking care of yourself, and you may want to even take down some notes, although Harrison assures me we're recording this so you can refer back to it. It's also something you may want to teach to some of your teenagers who are beginning to panic, right? Stop and recognize when you're feeling stressed, right? When we're feeling stressed, we sort of slip into that stressed feeling, sometimes without even realizing it. I remember when recently I heard or read about the fact that we touch our faces, 23 to 25 times an hour, right? Something we would only know in this, COVID-19 sort of era. And I thought to myself, who knew? And we tend to do that when we're, unconscious. We don't realize we're touching our face. Well, stress is the same way. We slip into that stressed out feeling when we don't know. So you have to call it out. You actually have to train yourself to go like, I'm doing it again, and call it out. And I would even give your demon, so to speak, a name, right? I call it my worry wart. Okay, my worry wart's doing it again. All right, okay, I hear you, right? And focus, you have to actually take a break. You have to actually have to breathe in through your nose, count to 3, and blow it out through your mouth. Why? Because it lowers your CO2 level, your carbon monoxide level or carbon dioxide level, and helps you oxygenate your brain and calms you down. And focus for a minute on either gratitude or your strengths and identify what you're actually feeling. People will say, I'm stressed. You'll have young people who will say, I'm stressed. Well, stressed is not a feeling, right? I'm afraid. That's a feeling. Fear is a feeling. I feel helpless. That's a feeling. I'm overwhelmed. That's a feeling, right? I'm sad. That's a feeling. And by the way, sad and depressed are not the same. Depressed is a hollow, empty feeling, right? Sad is, you have to have something to have been sad about. If you're sad, you're feeling a sense of loss, and that means you had something to lose in the first place. Depression is very different. It's like there wasn't anything to lose in the first place. It's an emptiness. So it's important to make that distinction when you're talking to your young people. And one of the things I recommend you talk about with yourself and with young people is, you're right. You can't do that now. You can't see your friends now. You're not going to be able to graduate now. You're not going to be able to, have that job, take that trip, meet that person. And you will later. And it's not going to make them feel better in the moment, but it's something that we need. This is about hope. Hope is not a strategy, right? I wouldn't, count on hope as a strategy. And yet we all need hope in order to thrive and look into the future. And help them to visualize a better day. This this too shall pass. It won't always be here. So, and laugh. I know that it may seem almost counterintuitive. Like, how can we laugh when things are so sad or things are so scary or things are so hard or difficult? And yet we need moments of inspiration. We need moments of comic relief. Laughter heals. And so there may even be time. I mean, I look at this thing I found online, and some of you know about, Sheldon and his, OCD stuff. Well, we're all Sheldons now. And in a way, it's good that we are, because it might keep us alive. So I want to talk a little bit also about what I call the shift from empathy to compassion, right? This is important for people who are caretakers, like all of you are, right? So caretakers have a very high burnout rate. We happen to know from studies from the Harvard Medical School and also from Stanford that about 24% of doctors and nurses in the United States, and by the way, this was before this pandemic, 24% are burned out, right? And so people looked into why is this? And I want to talk a little bit about a distinction between sympathy, which is feeling sorry for people, empathy, which is feeling with people, and compassion, which is loving kindness. Now, we're all hardwired to do something called mirroring, right? And empathy is rooted in that innate process of mirroring. What's mirroring? Mirroring is when, as an infant, you had no language and no way to let your mother know you were hungry or you needed a burp or you needed your diaper changed. So you would have this look on your face that your mother would mirror, like this look of distress or this look of anguish, and it would pull that person in, right? So we tend to reflect the nonverbal communication, the facial expressions of the people we are directly with. So if I'm excited and I'm telling a story like this, and my eyes are like, and then what happened? The people you're telling it to are doing that too, right? Well, mirroring is hardwired. It's not going to go away, but it can cause, when you're dealing with people who experience loss or who experience uncertainty or even abuse, right? You can take on their stress, their feelings of loss, and it leads to something we call empathic distress. It's incredibly critical for you as caretakers to understand this. That is the true source of burnout. So mirroring works like this, right? I'm going to show you an image in just a second. I'm going to flash it on the screen, and I want you to note your reaction, okay? So here it goes. Right? So most people see this cute little puppy dog. And if I'm in an audience with like 100 people, you'll hear, 99 of them will go, oh, that's so cute, right? That's mirroring. You see something cute and you feel that cuteness in yourself, right? Note your reaction to this, right? I show that and people shudder, right? Well, what happens is we tend to identify with and take on or feel other people's loss, which as an opener is fine. That's what makes us human. That's what allows us to be with people in some meaningful way. And yet we need to, if we're going to be useful to people and not burn out ourselves and take care of ourselves and to be there even more deeply for the people we work with, we need to shift from empathy to compassion. What does that mean? It is an intentional practice. You have to work at it. You have to train yourself to do this, right? So the first thing is you acknowledge that other person's emotion. That person's feeling frustrated, angry, sad, scared, and you may feel it too, right? And if you do feel it, identify what you're feeling in response to what that person is, sharing with you. And then I even say, where am I holding that? Like if I'm feeling sad, is it my shoulders? Do I feel it in my hips, in my back, where in my forehead? Where am I feeling that emotion that other person is communicating to me, right? That I'm absorbing actually. And then I have to remind myself, and this is a very active, intentional practice, I'm not having their experience, they are. What is it that they need from me right now? I'll tell you a very quick story. Many years ago, I met a couple, lovely couple, very healthy, wonderful people, church-going folks. Mother was a very successful business person. Husband was very successful. And the only reason they were in my office was the father had discovered that he had contracted ALS. And I went through I met their family, and they wanted to help me go through that process. And they said, we're going to fight this with everything we can, but I know that the prognosis is not great. And after 5 years, I watched this man deteriorate from a healthy person to being on crutches, to being in a wheelchair, to not being able to breathe, to not be able to talk, and then finally dying. And I was sitting a year after he died with his oldest son, who had been with him when he fell and died, and he was alone with his dad, and he couldn't save him. And he began with tears streaming out of him to talk about his sense of helplessness and watching his father die in front of him. I could not imagine. And I found myself tearing up. And then I said to myself, it's okay that you're tearing up, Bob. And what does this young man need from you right now? I don't think he needs you to cry. I think he needs you to be there for him. And you're going to find yourself in that situation very often. So I'm going to run through a couple of very quick things because I want to leave some time for questions. And again, this is going to be recorded and we can get you notes on this if you want. I also think there's some physical things you need to do to take care of yourself, right? Keep a daily schedule, right? Don't get into, if you're at home and you're sequestering yourself, have a schedule, get up at a certain time, get dressed, take a hot shower first thing in the morning. It gets you going. Factor in some outdoor time, get some exercise, work up a sweat from time to time. Stop watching the news. We're glued to the news. I don't know whoever thought the 24-hour news cycle was a good idea. I think it was the news people, not us. It will make you crazy. Like, check the news a couple of times a day, but stop watching it, right? Stay in touch with your young people. And there are lots of ways to do that, right? Build in your own friend time, your own family time, even if it's virtually. Chunk up your day, right? You need to be able to push yourself away from your computer, right? Have exercise time, have family time, have friend time, have reading time, have exercise time. Catch up on your sleep if you can. If you work in a very intensive youth program when we're normally with each other, you know that a lot of us are sleep deprived. We don't get to sleep. And so this is an opportunity to do that. And I like the term safe socializing, right? Rather than distancing, meaning let's be smart about being with each other, and keep a journal, meditate, read the Bible, and do that online, on the phone with your young people, right? Now, very quickly, I want to walk through the 5 mistakes that I think most adults make with kids. And by the way, this is based on my experience of 40 years working with young people and with people who work with young people. The first thing is we talk too much. What happens is, and I remember when I was young and I would get into trouble and my mother would catch me, she would give me a lecture and I would get it in about, 2 minutes, and she would go on for half an hour, and I think all of us tend to want to fix things and we end up getting nervous. And when we get nervous, we talk too much. And I think what we need to do is we need to be better listeners. We need to be able to give kids room or encourage them and invite them into sharing, whether it's through drawings or through sharing their hobbies or sharing their grief or sharing their feelings. We also get too emotional ourselves, which is what I was talking about just before, about shifting from empathy to compassion. That if we get too emotional, it will get in the way of us being there for our people. We try to fix things, and I understand that. We care about people. You would not be youth leaders if you didn't care about people. And so we hear something, we want to make it better. And I would advise you to listen before you try to fix, right? Be there for a person, because there are going to be a lot of things you can't fix. But the most powerful thing you can do is to be there for someone. And I have this sort of deep conviction about God and the universe, which is God would not have created such a beautiful universe and then not want it to be seen. So he created us as witnesses. And I think young people have this instilled in them. We all have it instilled in us. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. And so you may not be able to fix a problem, but you can hear and be there and sit with people while they have their grief, their sadness, their fear. Okay. So I would encourage you to replace judgment. Many of us say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. Well, people feel the way they feel, and we have to replace judgment with curiosity. We often tell kids what we don't want them to do rather than what we do want them to do. And all I mean by that is the more that you can be positive and suggest things to kids. And by the way, with teenagers in particular, I love to say to teenagers, I was thinking about something, but I'd like to know what you think about it, because I want them to feel like I am treating them as an equal partner in this conversation. That is incredibly important to teenagers. Okay. And we also forget to connect before we redirect, meaning, again, it's a little bit like trying to fix the problem before we connect with people, before we affirm them, before we understand what they're feeling. And you can feel something and do something different. And one of the things we always have to remind our teens about is you can feel something and not act on that feeling. I can be angry and have angry feelings and not do angry things. I can feel despondent and not do despondent things. So I think those are important pieces, things for you to remember. Some things you can do: get the kids to talk about themselves, have them share their drawings. I know someone who kids are going outside and doing chalk drawings and then taking pictures and sharing them on Instagram or just describing them to you. Let them dream out loud. Okay, so you can't do it now, but what about later? See if you can get them into a flow experience. What is a flow experience? It's like when you lose yourself, you're so absorbed in something, you momentarily lose track of time. That's what heals people. And certainly virtually, it's not as easy to get people into a flow experience, but even talking with people and getting into a conversation can be a flow experience. Have them tell you about their pet. I don't know about you, but even 14-year-old boys, adolescent boys, love dogs, right? And kids love to tell you about their pets. And there's a kind of agelessness to it. And when a kid tells you about their pet, they're letting you into their circle. Read with them, tell them a story, laugh together, share a little video clip. Disney Plus has some great little Pixar things that you can share on your screen and watch it together and then talk about it. So there are a lot of creative ways for you to reach out to people. And the last thing, and I'm just going to take 1 minute, and I apologize for going on, but remember that your vulnerability is a strength, right? That in your sadness or in your own feeling of vulnerability, that's what makes you a human being and makes you connect with people. Look for the strength in other people. You're going to have to remind teens of, yes, this is terrible, and this is hard, and not but, and you are strong. We may not be able to be together now, but we will be together later. And pray, obviously. And, I have a prayer myself, which is for the courage to be the strong man that God made me to be. And I ask to be calm and clear and compassionate and competent and patient. And it is okay. I don't want you to feel guilty about finding little slivers of silver linings in the work that you do. If there's some comic relief in the midst of tragedy or sadness, that is a healing thing, and we shouldn't feel guilty about that. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And Harrison, I apologize. I know I went on a little bit. But thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm going to stay on the line, obviously, in case there's some questions we can answer.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was absolutely awesome. And I think really helpful. I was actually getting some private text from a few people just explaining how much they enjoyed these pointers. So what we want to do, we didn't want to hold up too much of your time, but we will try to provide a few minutes for some questions. And if you give me a minute, I will go back to sharing my screen with you all. And so what I want to do is, Bob mentioned this idea of our head, our heart, and our feet. And I'm going to take a slightly different approach, but I want us to pause for a moment and think about, as you've listened to tonight's discussion, what are some of your initial thoughts with your head? Thinking about the heart, what are some of your feelings and sort of visceral feelings that you may have, and emotional responses that you may have to what you've heard? And then finally, when we look at feet, what are some of the things that you are thinking that might be next steps for you? So what we're going to do is, we do have my student Thomas. He's a Ph.D. student here, and Thomas Clanton is actually a former youth pastor and now is studying faith and understanding how teenagers sort of establish their faith and become committed to their faith. That's what his research is looking at. So what we want to do is we want to use the chat box to ask you all to, present some questions, and Thomas, he'll go ahead and read those questions off for us. I don't have the chat box in front of me, so he'll sort of guide us through that, and then that way no one is put on the spot about having to be on screen or trying to unmute. So go ahead and start asking your questions, or if there's a thought that you want to share, please give that to Thomas, and then Thomas, I will ask you to go ahead and unmute and let us know what individuals are saying or thinking.
Well, to start off with, I have one here from Corliss that says, how do you deal with your own personal mental exhaustion when you were spiraling?
Bob, I'll let you take that one.
Okay, yeah, great. So first of all, I think we're all going to have moments of that mental exhaustion. I know I do myself. And I think if you go back to those steps that I talked about, like, you have to really kind of call it out. And I know it almost seems kind of like adolescent to, speaking of adolescence, to, give it a name, but I actually think it helps to put you in the driver's seat. But I also think you have to have your own sort of safety net, your circle of people, your call list. Like, who are the people you can get on the phone and call and say, I'm having a moment right now, I'm spiraling. I mean, to be honest with you, we use that technique with people who are recovering from substance abuse. If I get teenagers who get caught into substance abuse, one of the things that we do is, when they go to use, they, instead of using, they pick up the phone and they call someone who is trusted. And I think you need to establish that kind of circle of support for yourself. So pick up the phone and, and call somebody and say, I'm really feeling overwhelmed, or I'm spiraling again. And can we just talk for a few minutes? Because I think calling it out, putting yourself, one of the things, by the way, is it's better to play offense than it is to play defense, emotionally speaking. And so when you give something a name and you call it out and you say, you kind of take it on, you kind of yell at it, it's putting you in the driver's seat. It actually shifts something in your brain, and I could go into the chemistry of that, but I won't. And then I think have that call circle. Get those people that you care about and who care about you, and call one of them and say, I'm having this moment. I just need to talk to you for a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here from Kelly. She says, thoughts on whether asking youth to bring something to virtual youth group is ideal? Does it seem like too much of an assignment?
Harrison, I'm going to let you chime in on that too, but I just want to say one thing. I think teenagers like choice, right? So I think if you present it as a choice, not as an assignment, and then if they do, they do, and if they don't, they don't. But as long as they feel like they're have choice, I think that's fine. Harrison, I think you're muted there. Your mic is muted.
Thank you. Yes, I was. Thank you. I'll echo exactly what you said. I think that is absolutely the case. But I would also add to that in addition to choice, some of it is not just do they have a choice, but maybe asking them and allowing them to assist you in deciding what does that process look like. So as an example, we're seeing a lot of TikTok challenges, and I'm not on TikTok, but I've been seeing them popping up on other social media platforms. And so if you were, instead of saying, I want you all to do this, or I want you all to bring this to our virtual group, sort of empowering those youth to say, hey, what are some things that we can do that you all would find interesting? What are some ways that you all might be engaged? But hey, I saw this on TikTok. This was a really cool TikTok challenge they did. Have you all thought about doing something like that? And if so, what would it look like? And I think that sort of lends also to what Bob is saying about that choice being available.
I'd like to add one thing to that too, Harrison, because as you were talking, it triggered a thought in me, which is many of us, I'll speak for myself, I know a lot of young people who use TikTok. I don't use it myself. You might even ask one of them to, hey, could you teach the rest of us how to do it? Make them the expert.
Absolutely.
Well, to continue with the theme of connection, Neil asked, how do you connect aside from social media in this kind of time of social distancing? Does anybody have any ideas about that?
So what I would say is I think two things. One is the encouraging you all to definitely use that chat box to respond, since everyone's mics are muted and stuff. But I think what I've been seeing, Neil, and it's sort of social media a little bit, but I've actually been following a couple of groups that have been doing online video games, and so. I didn't know this until the teenagers at our church showed this to me. Teenagers will sit around and watch other teens play video games, and it's a thing. And
Yeah.
and so I've seen a few youth leaders around the country that are using that as a way of bringing their teenagers together. I think the beauty of the letters is again, it's just that it's that surprise. And I see someone talking about the phone calls. But I've also been sort of challenging some youth leaders down in Florida to think about what are ways that you might be able to use those young people to help serve some of the others in your congregation. So as an example, we know that shopping for groceries is a challenge. It's a major challenge for some of the more vulnerable members of our community. So is there a way for us to safely empower those teenagers to do the shopping for those, members of the community of your organization that might be at risk if they were to actually go out on their own? And so it gives them a way to connect. Again, it may not necessarily be the physical connection, but it could be I'm coming and I'm knocking on your front door and I'm dropping this off and I'm waving to you, and that gives me an opportunity to interact with others. And it also could be a sense of empowerment, because now I'm not helpless. I'm actually being able to contribute in a meaningful way to help others who would be at risk if they were to leave their home. And so that's just one example that I would offer.
Okay, moving on to a different subject. I have a question here. Many of our teens are scared, especially my Black teens, about dying because of the increase in rates and lack of respect for the Black community. Any advice on how to reassure them?
Harrison, I'm going to let you take that one first. And I've got some ideas about it, but I think you should take that first.
Okay. That is a really good question and a challenging question. And I think because I've actually sort of been wrestling with how do we empower our teens. We recognize multiple reports have been showing that there's a higher mortality rate in African American communities. And so the question I've actually been wrestling with myself over the past few days is, what are ways in which we can empower our teenagers to not only educate themselves and educate their community, but to come up with solutions to how can some of these issues be addressed. And my initial suggestion would be to figure out ways that we can have conversations with our teenagers to help them to be informed, right? Sometimes a lot of our fear stems from just the fact that we don't have all of the information, right? And so Bob made that comment about the television and, the 24/7 news cycle. And so if we are constantly hearing, sort of the sensationalized, perspective of, certain communities, especially African-American communities being most vulnerable, but we're not getting information to help us understand what might be some factors that are contributing to that, or what might be some preventative steps that can help to address that. Fear can set in for our teenagers. So I would start with how do we first off get you all informed and get as much information in your hands? And I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. But secondly, what are ways that they might be able to reasonably, help to inform their community and empower them to be able to address that, so that those fears can be, subsided, because now we have information that is, empowering us to move forward.
Yeah, I would say that it's important to acknowledge two things there. One is, we acknowledge the fear, like I can see how frightened you are, and also the reality of it, which is that, yes, we have, many of us who are paying attention have noticed and heard that African American communities are suffering greater percentages of losses. And I also think without you can't give people a guarantee about this, but I love the idea that Harrison talks about, which is, can we kind of find out what are the factors that are making that true? Like, is it that maybe, information hasn't trickled down about how to protect yourself better, or maybe African-American families living close together don't have access to the things they need to keep themselves safe. And I would also point out that we've noticed that, younger people and, 14, 15, 16 years old and younger don't seem, for whatever reason we don't understand, to get as sick. It's really, 20 years old and over, and we're not sure why. And again, that's not a guarantee, so you have to be careful about that. But I love the idea of, can we figure out how to help our communities get better information and protect ourselves better, practice better safe socializing and that sort of thing.
Okay, if anybody has any more questions, I'll give you a minute or so to type that in. If not, we can.
I'll ask a question while people are thinking, and this is for you, Bob. I know that some of the people who are logged in don't necessarily work with teenagers, but they might work with school-age children, elementary school, and maybe even 4-year-olds. Are there any thoughts that you may have about some of the challenges that that particular age group, might be encountering, that we can at least put that on those that are logged in tonight, put it on their radar, just some things to think about when we're talking about that, I would say 4 to 10-year-old, 4 to 11-year-old range?
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. That's a great question. So first of all, kids in that age range tend to get really caught up in the moment. They tend to be, and which, you can actually use to your advantage. So on the one hand, they may be caught up in a moment of fear or sadness or frustration. And it's easier in some ways to actually get them caught up in a different moment. So one of the things about working with kids that age, 4 to 10, 4 to 11, is, you may encounter them when they're in one mood. And if you are skillful at engaging them, you can actually get them into something else. Like, let's talk about a drawing, or let's talk about something fun or whatever. So so they very much get caught up in the moment. The second thing is they have a shorter attention span. So I noticed that even with my kids. So I see, as I mentioned, I see a youngster who's 8, I see a youngster who's 9, and I see a couple of kids who are 11 and 12. And I'm having to do telehealth, sessions with them. I can't see them in person. And I'm finding that I can only do half the time. And I'd rather do, half the time more frequently than, try to keep them engaged for a full hour. So I think that attention span piece is really important. So whatever you might have a 5 or 10 minute call, and that's okay. And it might be very positive, and you might feel like it wasn't enough time, but that's exactly how those kids kind of log things in shorter chunks of time. Harrison, I'm going to actually log out because I think you're going to share some resources and ways people can get some information. And I just want to thank you and all of the people behind the scenes at Clemson who helped make this happen. And it was a pleasure to talk to everybody tonight. And Harrison, a pleasure to work with you. And thanks for that opportunity. And everybody be safe out there.
Thank you so much, Bob. We really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And so I see a few more comments have come in, but what we will do is, for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and stop here. I wanted to introduce you all to the other team members here at Clemson who are doing a lot of work with teenagers. And so I wanted to provide their information if you wanted to reach out to any of them. Of course, you know, you have me here at the bottom, but Ed Bowers is a professor here who most of his work is focused on mentoring and understanding the best practices in mentoring young people and especially teenagers. Barry Garstu was actually very instrumental in getting Bob Ditter to join us for this session. A lot of his work deals with parenting and family structures and parenting styles and how those practices within families come together to influence the development of young people. He also has a lot of experience working with camp settings. And so when we think about our kids going off to summer camps, he's been heavily engaged in the camp setting for many years and does a lot of work and research around that area, in addition to actually serving and working at camps. And then lastly, we have Dr. Corliss Outley, and all of these are doctors, so forgive me for that, but Dr. Corliss Outley and her work specifically focuses on really two things. One, she deals a lot with race and identity and thinking about issues of diversity and inclusion and diversity trainings and how do you work with diverse populations, especially youth populations. But another thing that she does is youth empowerment and how do we really work with our young people to give them a voice and to give them the reins and allow them to take ownership in our youth programs where it's not constantly a sort of, you know, pulling teeth and trying to get them to be engaged with us, but instead, you know, they have some true buy-in and they carry their fair share of the load of lifting. And then of course you have myself. And so thank you all so much for being on here today. And what we will be doing is when this comes to a close, we will actually provide a link to each of you where you can be able to watch this again. We definitely want to encourage you to share this with any others that you work with that you believe that this information would be valuable for. In about a week's time, you'll get an email asking you to please evaluate this session and let us know if this was useful and if there were any other ways in which we could possibly assist you all. One idea that I have, depending on, you know, how much longer we're sort of secluded over the next few months, is that we may try to do a follow-up and bring everyone together to do more of a interactive creative think tank where we're sitting down and we're all opening our mics and being able to get into some group sessions and really talk about what's working and what challenges we might be facing with our youth, and understanding that you all are coming and logging in here from all over the country. So even though I'm sitting in South Carolina, most of the people that are currently involved in this call right now are not in the state of South Carolina. We have people in Colorado and Florida and Georgia and Texas and so many other places around the United States. And so, you know, it's good for us to get together and have these conversations and to support one another. So thank you all so much. And we look forward to sharing with you all again in the near future.